In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen the very best and the absolute worst of humanity walk through the doors of my courtroom. I have seen killers weep and saints lie. But there is one case, one single decision that has followed me like a shadow for 2 decades. It is the story of how I sentenced a man to life in prison, only to have his son walk into my courtroom 20 years later and change everything I thought I knew about justice. It was a cold morning in the fall of 2004 when I first saw David Miller. He was an ordinary man, a husband and a father, who worked as a high school history teacher. But the crime he was accused of was anything but ordinary: the brutal murder of his neighbor, a man with whom he had a well documented property dispute. The prosecutor, a young and ambitious man named Richard Davenport, presented a case that seemed airtight, a perfect puzzle of circumstantial evidence. There was the argument over a fence, a partial footprint that matched David's work boots, and a witness who claimed to have seen David's car leaving the scene around the time of the murder. Davenport painted a picture of a man pushed to the edge, a quiet teacher who snapped under pressure. He was confident, and his confidence was infectious, spreading through the jury box like a fever. I remember watching David Miller throughout the trial. He was quiet, his face a mask of disbelief. He never lost his composure, not even when the prosecutor held up the photos of the crime scene. He just sat there, shaking his head slowly, as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life. His wife, Sarah, sat in the front row every single day, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes never leaving her husband's face. And next to her was their son, a small boy of about 8 years old named Daniel. I remember the boy most of all. He would sit there, trying to be brave for his father, but I could see the fear and confusion in his wide brown eyes. He didn't understand the words being said, but he understood the feeling in the room. He knew his world was falling apart. David's public defender was overworked and outmatched. He did his best, but he couldn't poke any significant holes in the prosecution's story. David's alibi was weak. He claimed he was at home, alone, reading a book. It was his word against a mountain of circumstantial evidence. When the jury came back with a guilty verdict, a gasp echoed through the courtroom. Sarah Miller collapsed into tears, her body shaking with sobs. But David, he just looked at me. There was no anger in his eyes, no hatred. There was only a deep, profound sadness and a quiet insistence of his innocence. He mouthed the words, "I didn't do it." But the jury had spoken. My hands were tied. I did what the law required me to do. I sentenced David Miller to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led him away, his son, Daniel, cried out, "Daddy!" It was a sound that I would hear in my quietest moments for the next 20 years. It was the sound of a life breaking. Have you ever heard a sound that you know you will never be able to forget? A sound that becomes a part of your memory forever? Let me know in the comments below because that little boy's cry is etched into my soul. 20 years passed. I grew older, my hair turned from brown to silver, and the lines on my face deepened with each case I heard. The world changed, technology evolved, and the faces in my courtroom became younger and younger. The case of David Miller faded, not from my memory, but from the forefront of my mind. It became one of 1,000 difficult decisions, a scar on a long career. I told myself I had done the right thing, that I had followed the law. I had to believe that otherwise the weight of it all would have been too much to bear. I had sent a man to spend the rest of his days in a concrete box, to grow old and die away from his family. The justice system is not perfect, and sometimes we judges have to live with the ghosts of our decisions. David Miller was one of my ghosts. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, my world was turned upside down. It was a routine day, filled with motions and minor hearings. I was listening to a lawyer argue over a zoning dispute, my mind half drifting, when my clerk handed me a note. It said a lawyer was here to file an emergency motion on a closed case. I sighed, annoyed at the interruption. I told my clerk to send him in. A young man walked into my courtroom. He was tall and sharp, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. He moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room. There was an intensity in his eyes, a fire that I hadn't seen in a long time. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. He walked to the podium, his footsteps echoing in the nearly empty courtroom. He placed his briefcase on the table and opened it with practiced precision. He looked directly at me, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and steady, "my name is Daniel Miller." The name hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at him, really looked at him, and suddenly I saw him. The 8-year-old boy with the wide brown eyes. He was a man now, but the same fire, the same look of a world falling apart, was still there, buried deep beneath years of pain and determination. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with quiet chatter just moments before, fell completely silent. My clerk stopped typing. The bailiff shifted his weight, his hand instinctively moving closer to his side. It felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Daniel Miller stood before me, no longer a child, but a man on a mission. He was the ghost of my past, made real. "I am here today," he continued, his voice unwavering, "to file a motion to introduce new evidence in the case of the state versus David Miller from 20 years ago." The current prosecutor, a woman named Ms. Jennings, let out a short, sharp laugh. "Your Honor, this is absurd. That case was closed 2 decades ago. The defendant was found guilty by a jury of his peers. This is a complete waste of the court's time." She looked at me, expecting me to agree, to dismiss this young lawyer and his impossible quest. But I couldn't. I looked at Daniel Miller, at the son who had spent his entire life living with the consequences of my decision, and I saw something I couldn't ignore. I saw the truth. I felt a strange mix of dread and curiosity. Part of me wanted to shut it down, to protect myself from the past, to not reopen a wound that had long since scarred over. But the judge in me, the part that still believed in the pursuit of justice, no matter how painful, knew I had to listen. "Mr. Miller," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears, "you are making an extraordinary claim. The burden of proof is on you. What new evidence could you possibly have after all this time?" Daniel didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "Your Honor, I have evidence that will not only prove my father's innocence, but will also reveal the identity of the real killer." The finality in his voice sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't a desperate son clinging to false hope. This was a lawyer who had come to win. Against my better judgment, against every instinct for self-preservation, I made a decision. "I will hear your motion, Mr. Miller. Be in my courtroom tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and be prepared." As he turned to leave, I knew that my life and the life of his father was about to change forever. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went down to the courthouse archives, the dusty basement where old cases go to be forgotten. I found the file for the state versus David Miller. The box was heavy with the weight of a man's life. I sat there for hours, under the dim glow of a single light bulb, reading through the transcripts, looking at the crime scene photos, reliving the trial that had haunted me for 20 years. I saw it all through new eyes now, the eyes of a judge who had seen too much, who knew how easily the system could fail. I saw the small inconsistencies I had dismissed, the questions that were never asked, the threads that were never pulled. I saw the shadow of a doubt, a shadow that had been there all along, but one I had chosen to ignore in the face of the prosecution's confident narrative. The next morning, my courtroom was packed. Word had spread like wildfire. A son, now a lawyer, fighting to free the father a judge had sentenced to life. It was the kind of story that movies are made of, but for me, sitting on that bench, it was terrifyingly real. Daniel Miller walked in, just as calm and composed as the day before. He stood at the podium and began. He didn't start with emotion or accusations. He started with cold, hard facts. He started with the star witness for the prosecution, the neighbor who claimed to have seen David Miller's car. Your Honor, Daniel began, the prosecution's entire case 20 years ago rested on the testimony of one man, Mr. Henderson. He was the only person who placed my father near the scene of the crime. He then presented his first piece of new evidence. It was a financial record showing that Mr. Henderson had received a payment of $50,000 from an anonymous source just 1 week after my verdict. The money was deposited into an offshore account. 20 years ago, tracking such a thing would have been nearly impossible. But with today's technology, Daniel had unraveled it. $50,000, Your Honor. A life-changing amount of money for a man who was drowning in debt. Enough money, perhaps, to convince him to say he saw something he didn't. The prosecutor, Ms. Jennings, jumped to her feet. Objection! This is speculation. It proves nothing. But the seed of doubt had been planted. I looked at the jury, and I could see it in their eyes, too. Next, Daniel moved to the murder weapon. It was a heavy wrench found near the body. Back in 2004, forensic science was limited. They had found no usable fingerprints. Your Honor, Daniel said, we have had the murder weapon re-examined using modern forensic techniques. And while there were no fingerprints, they did find something else. A single strand of hair caught in the threads of the wrench. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. We ran a DNA test on that hair. It does not belong to my father, David Miller. A murmur went through the courtroom. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was the unraveling. But Daniel wasn't finished. He began to systematically dismantle the original timeline of the crime. He used cell phone tower data, something that was in its infancy 20 years ago and largely ignored by the original defense. The record showed that David Miller's phone had pinged a tower 10 miles away from the crime scene just minutes before the estimated time of death. He was on a call with his mother. It was an alibi, a real, verifiable alibi that had been sitting in a box in an archive for 2 decades, completely overlooked. My father told them he was home, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion for the first time. He told them he was on the phone with his mother, but they didn't believe him. It was easier to believe the story of a quiet teacher who snapped. Ms. Jennings, the prosecutor, was pale. Her case, the case that had been a closed chapter for 20 years, was being torn to shreds in front of her eyes. She tried to object, to argue that the evidence was too old, that the chain of custody was broken. But Daniel was prepared. He had a paper trail for everything. He had spent his entire life preparing for this day. He had gone to law school for one reason, and one reason only: to free his father. He had dedicated his existence to correcting the mistake that I had made. What do you think is the most powerful motivator in the world? Is it love? Is it revenge? For Daniel Miller, it was justice, and he was a force of nature. Then came the final, devastating blow, the moment that would shatter the case into a million pieces. Daniel Miller saved his most powerful piece of evidence for last. Your Honor, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, for 20 years, my father has sat in a cell for a crime he did not commit. And for 20 years, the real killer has been living a quiet life, a life bought with $50,000. He turned and looked at the back of the courtroom. The DNA found on the murder weapon, the single strand of hair, it does not match my father, but it does match someone else. He paused, and the silence in the room was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the sound of my own breathing. It matches Mr. Henderson, the prosecution's star witness. A collective gasp filled the room. It was a sound of pure shock. Mr. Henderson, the man whose testimony had sealed David Miller's fate, was the real killer. He had murdered the neighbor, and then, to save himself, he had framed David, taking money to solidify his lie. It was a betrayal so profound, so evil, that it was almost impossible to comprehend. Daniel then played a video. It was a recent deposition, a deathbed confession from the lead detective on the original case. The detective, old and frail, admitted everything. He admitted that he was under pressure to close the high profile case, that he suspected Henderson but couldn't prove it, so he offered him a deal. He told Henderson to testify against David Miller, and in return, he would make sure the investigation into him disappeared. He helped him hide the money. He buried the truth to save his own career. I sat on the bench, frozen. The room was spinning. The weight of 20 years, the weight of an innocent man's life, came crashing down on me. I had been a pawn in a corrupt game. I had trusted the system. I had trusted the evidence presented to me, and in doing so, I had become an instrument of a monstrous injustice. I looked at Daniel Miller, his face grim, his eyes filled with a sad, terrible victory. He had done it. He had freed his father, but he could never give him back the 20 years that had been stolen. I looked at the jury, at the reporters, at the stunned faces in the gallery, and then I looked at the empty space where David Miller should have been sitting. The guilt was overwhelming. It was a physical pain, a crushing weight on my chest. I had failed. As a judge, as a human being, I had failed. There was nothing left to say. The case was not just overturned, it was obliterated. I looked at Ms. Jennings. She was speechless. She simply shook her head and sat down. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I gripped the gavel. In light of the new evidence presented to this court, I began, my voice hoarse, the conviction of Mr. David Miller is hereby overturned. He is exonerated of all charges. He is a free man. I slammed the gavel down, and the sound echoed the breaking of a 20-year-old lie. The courtroom erupted. Reporters ran for the doors. Daniel Miller stood still for a moment. Then slowly he closed his eyes and let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for his entire life. He then packed his briefcase with the same calm precision with which he had opened it, gave me a single unreadable nod, and walked out of the courtroom to go and get his father. I saw it on the news a few days later, the moment David Miller walked out of the prison gates. He was an old man now, his hair white, his face etched with the lines of a life lived in a cage. He looked lost, blinking in the bright sunlight as if seeing it for the first time. And then he saw his son. Daniel ran to him, and the two men embraced. The father, who had gone to prison when his son was a boy, and the son, who had become a man and moved heaven and earth to bring him home. It was a moment of profound love and heartbreaking tragedy. I watched, and for the first time in my career, I cried. I cried for the years that were stolen, for the family that was broken, and for my own role in all of it. That case changed me. It forced me to look at the system I had served my entire life with new critical eyes. It's a system of laws, but it's run by people, and people are fallible. We are ambitious, we are lazy, we are biased, and we make mistakes. My mistake cost a man 20 years of his life. The detective's ambition cost him his soul. The prosecutor's confidence blinded him to the truth. This story isn't just about one innocent man. It's about the thousands of others who might be sitting in a cell right now, waiting for someone to believe them. It's about the importance of questioning everything, of never accepting a story just because it's easy, and of fighting for the truth, no matter how long it takes. Daniel Miller taught me that. The 8-year-old boy who watched his father be taken away grew up to be the man who reminded a jaded old judge what justice is really about. It's not about winning or losing, it's about the truth. And the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, will always eventually find its way to the light. This case was the beginning of the end of my career on the bench. I couldn't sit there anymore, pretending to be an infallible arbiter of fate. I knew I had to do something different. I had to share these stories, the stories of the forgotten, the wronged, and the redeemed. Because if we don't learn from our mistakes, we are doomed to repeat them. And that is a sentence that no one should have to serve. If this story has moved you, please share it. Subscribe for more stories from my courtroom, and let's continue to fight for a justice system that is truly just for all.